لحضوركم لجلسة شبكة السياسات الفلسطينية بعنوان أطر التحرر. بفكر هاي الجلسة كتير مهمة وتوقيتها كتير مهم، خاصة بعد امبارح. يعني أنا بشكركم جميعا للحضور بعد يوم طويل، ولكنه كان كتير ثري وغني بالمعلومات والنقاشات. بس كمان اللي صار امبارح هو لحظة تاريخية ومفصلية في نضالنا الفلسطيني نحو التحرر، لأنه مثل كتير لحظات بال15 شهر الماضيين مش بس غير طريقة تفكيرنا، وكان لحظة مفصلية بكيف مش بس بنفكر كيف لازم نعيد التفكير بكيف نشتغل، سواء كان بالتنظير والأكاديمية والبحث، ولكن أيضا على الأرض. إحنا للعقود الماضية تحدد قدرتنا على التفكير وتأطير طريقنا للتحرر بأطر شوي مسطحة وصلبة ومفروضة علينا، من فكرة الدولة للمؤسسات الدولية للكومبرومايز مع ما بعرف قوى دولية وإقليمية ومحلية. ولكن اللي عم بيصير على الأرض ورجانا إنه المخيال الفلسطيني أوسع من هيك، ونحن قادرين مش بس نفكر والوصول إلى التحرير والتحرر، ولكن أيضا كسر السجن والعودة، سواء كان بقدرتنا على التفكير وكمان على الأرض وفي الحقيقة. فاليوم بفكر البانل تبعت الشبكة بتفكيرنا بأطر التحرر ومعنى التقسيم اللي هو محدد للتحرر والنضال وحق تقرير المصير، هي كلها مش بس مفاهيم مهمة، ولكن بال15 شهر الماضيين شفناها تتحقق على الأرض. اليوم عنا متحدثتين ومتحدث، زميلاتي الدكتورة ليلى فرسخ، الدكتورة يارا هواري، والدكتور مهند عياش. سوف نبدأ مع الدكتورة ليلى فرسخ. للأسف هي مش موجودة معنا، ولكن في تسجيل. سوف تتحدث باللغة العربية، كل متحدثة ومتحدث معهم 20 دقيقة، وبعدين نفتح المجال للنقاش. رح نبلش مع الدكتورة ليلى فرسخ. الدكتورة ليلى هي بروفيسور في العلوم السياسية في جامعة بوسطن في ماساتشوستس. ألفت العديد من الكتب والمقالات حول الاقتصاد السياسي للصراع الاستعمار الإسرائيلي في فلسطين، ومبدأ التقسيم وما بعده في حل القضية الفلسطينية. من أهم كتبها إعادة التفكير في مفهوم الدولة الفلسطينية، حق تقرير المصير وإنهاء الاستعمار ما بعد مبدأ التقسيم، والذي صدر بالعام 2021. العمالة الفلسطينية في إسرائيل ومشروع الدولة الفلسطينية 1967 ل 2007، وهو من نشر من مواطن ومؤسسة الدراسات الفلسطينية للعام 2009. وحررت أيضا مع الدكتور بشير كتاب المسألتان العربية واليهودية، جغرافيات الاشتباك في فلسطين وما يتجاوزها، وهو كتاب تم نشره للعام 2020. الدكتورة ليلى سوف تتحدث حول التحرير السياسي الفلسطيني بعد الحرب على غزة، حق تقرير المصير ما بعد منظومة التقسيم. الدكتورة ليلى سوف تتحدث لمدة 20 دقيقة تقريبا. ممكن تحطوا لنا التسجيل لو سمحتوا؟
بعد تهجير ثلثين من الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضه. إن حرب الإبادة حول. شكرا جدا لاستضافتي في المنتدى السنوي لفلسطين. يؤسفني أنني لم أستطع أن أكون معكم وجاهيا، ولكن يسعدني أن أقدم لكم ملخص عن ورقتي الذي يدور عنوانه حول معنى التحرر الوطني الفلسطيني بعد الحرب على غزة. بالفعل، ما هو التحرر الوطني الفلسطيني في أعقاب الحرب الإبادة التي شنتها إسرائيل على غزة؟ في أعقاب نكبة جديدة يعيشها شعبنا في غزة، نكبة لم نتخيلها ممكنة في جيلنا، نكبة فاقت نكبة 48 بحجم الدمار والتهجير والقتل. فإلى يومنا هذا قد قتل أكثر من 47 ألف فلسطيني، منهم 17 ألف طفل، وأصيب أكثر من 110 ألاف جريح، وتم تهجير 90% من سكان غزة أكثر من مرة. فكيف لنا أن نتكلم عن مشروع الوطن الفلسطيني وتحديد معالمه بعد الدمار الذي خلفته هذه الحرب، وفي ظل الانقسام الذي لم تستطع هذه الحرب إنهاؤه، وفشل القيادة الفلسطينية في رام الله في حماية مدنييها وتمثيلهم بشرعية ووحدة وطنية، رغم المقاومة الباسلة التي دامت أكثر من 15 شهرا؟ فاجأت العالم بما في ذلك الفلسطينيين أنفسهم بصمودها وتنظيمها وقدرتها على إرجاع القضية الفلسطينية إلى مركزيتها عالميا وإقليميا رغم الثمن الباهظ الذي يدفعه الشعب الفلسطيني. إن الحرب الإبادة التي تمارسها إسرائيل منذ أكثر من 15 شهر هي الأطول من كل الحروب التي شنتها إسرائيل منذ تكوينها في 48. خاضها شعبنا والمقاومة الفلسطينية وليست الجيوش العربية، وصمد فيها أكثر من أي صمود أي جيش عربي، وأكثر من صمود المقاومة في بيروت في 1982. هذه الحرب الأخيرة أوصلت القضية الفلسطينية إلى مفصل تاريخي مهم جدا، مفصل بأهمية المفصل التاريخي الذي واجهته القضية في 48 بعد تهجير ثلثين من الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضهم. إن حرب الإبادة الإسرائيلية على غزة أعادتنا إلى نقطة البداية، إلى حرب 48 وليس إلى حرب 67، وبالتالي هزت المنظومة السياسية التي فرضتها إسرائيل والدول الغربية وأولها الولايات المتحدة بأن الصراع العربي الإسرائيلي محصور بعواقب حرب 67 وحله معتمد على مبدأ مقايضة الأرض للسلام كما أقره قرار الأمم المتحدة 242، وتم تبنيه في كل عملية سلام في المنطقة بما في ذلك عملية أوسلو. هذا المفصل التاريخي الذي أقحمته علينا حرب غزة يتطلب منا إعادة النظر في المشروع التحرر الفلسطيني الذي تبنته منظمة التحرير في 88 مع إعلان الاستقلال وقبولها بقرار مجلس الأمن 242 ومطالبتها بدولة فلسطينية في الضفة الغربية وغزة. فهذه الدولة الفلسطينية التي تم الاعتراف بها من قبل 147 دولة وقبلت كعضو كامل من قبل الجمعية العمومية في الأمم المتحدة لا تزال دون سيادة فعلية وغير قابلة للاستدامة، كما نرى اليوم في قرارات نتنياهو والحكومة الإسرائيلية بمحاولة ضم الضفة الغربية أو معظم الضفة الغربية إلى إسرائيل. لكن الخطاب السياسي الرسمي إن كان في فتح أو حماس لا يزال ملتزم بحل الدولتين واعترافه بحق إسرائيل كما أقرت منظمة التحرير في 93 وبالمطالبة بدولة فلسطينية. كما يركز الخطاب العربي والدولي الرسمي على أهمية تحقيق هذه الدولة لإنهاء الحرب المتواصلة من خلال خطة طريق جديدة تحاول الولايات المتحدة ترويجها مع دعم من الدول العربية متعددة. فالسؤال الذي يواجهنا اليوم هو تفسير هذا الإصرار على المطالبة بدولة فلسطينية في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة رغم استحالة تحقيقها عملياً. وما إذا كان يخدم هذا الإصرار على هذه الدولة، هل يخدم القضية الفلسطينية أو يساهم في تصفيتها بعد الحرب على غزة؟ هل لا يزال مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية الوسيلة الوحيدة للتحرر أم هو عقبة في تحقيق التحرر؟ إن الإنتاج المعرفي على مدار العقدين السابقين استفاض في معالجة هذه المسألة، مسألة أهمية تكوين دولة فلسطينية ولو على جزء من أرض فلسطين التاريخية، بقدر ما انتقد هذا المشروع وركز على مخاطره في تهميش القضية الفلسطينية ومحي فحواها التحرري. ما سأحاول القيام به في هذه المداخلة هو تفسير هذا التمسك الرسمي العربي والفلسطيني بمشروع الدولة، وما هو البديل له، بديل بوادره موجودة وتطالبنا الحرب على غزة بالتمعن به بجدية. فيما يتعلق بالمسألة الأولى، أي لماذا لا تزال القيادة الفلسطينية وفئة كبيرة من الشعب الفلسطيني خاصة في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة التمسك بمشروع الدولة رغم فشله؟ هناك جوابان. الأول متعلق بمفهوم الواقعية السياسية، فيجادل الكثيرون أن في ضوء الإجماع الدولي على التقسيم وحل الدولتين وحقيقة قوة إسرائيل العسكرية والاقتصادية ووصول ترامب إلى الحكم في أمريكا، يبقى خيار الدولة الفلسطينية في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة الخيار الواقعي الوحيد المتاح ولذلك المهم التمسك به. ويرى الكثيرون أن الحرب على غزة خلقت الضغط اللازم لإقناع الولايات المتحدة وغيرها بضرورة تحقيق هذه الدولة لإنهاء الصراع وأيضا لحماية إسرائيل. فبالنسبة لهؤلاء الواقعيين الخيار اليوم ليس في التخلي عن فكرة الدولة أو حل الدولتين، وإنما في كيفية إجبار إسرائيل بالالتزام بالقرارات الدولية وممارسة الضغط عليها للاعتراف بهذه الدولة، إما عن طريق الدبلوماسية أو عن طريق الحرب أو عن طريق سياسات المقاطعة وغيرها. فتصبح الدولة الفلسطينية الثمن لانخراط إسرائيل في المنطقة من خلال إبرام اتفاقيات سلام بين إسرائيل ودول عربية كبرى، مثل ما يجري الحديث اليوم عن تحقيق أو محاولة إبرام اتفاقية بين إسرائيل والسعودية بعد أن يتم الاعتراف طريق واقعي أو خطة واقعية للوصول إلى دولة فلسطينية. لفهم هذه النظرة من الضروري أيضا الأخذ بعين الاعتبار البعد الاقتصادي السياسي لمشروع الدولة الفلسطينية كما فعلت في كتابي الأخير. فاستمرارية مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية ليس فقط مرتبط بموضوع الواقعية السياسية، وإنما مرتبط بمصالح مالية واقتصادية التي استثمرت في هذا المشروع، ليس على المستوى الفلسطيني فحسب، وإنما أيضا على المستوى الإقليمي والعالمي. فمشروع الدولة الفلسطينية ممول معتمد على رأس مال ورأس ماليين صنعوا أموالهم في الخليج، ويطبق مستقبلهم واستدامته مع هذه المصالح ورؤوس الأموال الإقليمية والدولية التي مهدت لها الاتفاقات الإبراهيمية في 2020. لكن من وجهة نظري هناك سبب آخر وراء تمسك الكثيرين بمشروع الدولة الفلسطينية، ذلك لأنه يؤكد ويحمي حق الشعب الفلسطيني في تقرير المصير، وبالتالي يؤكد على على وجودنا السياسي في إطار عملية سلام بدأت بإنكار حقوقنا الفلسطينية، كما فعل قرار 242 وقرار الأمم المتحدة 242. فقرار مجلس الأمن 242 في 67 والذي شكل حجر الأساس لكل اتفاقية سلام بين إسرائيل والدول العربية لا يذكر الفلسطينيين أو أي من حقوقهم، ويشير إليهم فقط على أنهم لاجئين بحاجة إلى حل إنساني، دون ذكر أي من القرارات الأممية المتعلقة بالقضية الفلسطينية مثل قرار 194 و 181. إن تمسك القيادة الفلسطينية بمشروع الدولة الفلسطينية إذن ناتج عن محاولة تأكيد أحقية الحقوق السياسية وليس فقط الإنسانية، الحقوق السياسية بما في ذلك حق التقرير المصير وحق العودة للشعب الفلسطيني. كان إذن لمشروع الدولة الفلسطينية دورا مهما لتثبيت وشرعنة الوجود السياسي الفلسطيني في ظل نظام دولي مبني على شرعية الدولة القومية وعلى دورها المركزي في حماية حقوق الشعوب، لكنه لم يكن كافيا لنيل الاستقلال، وذلك لسببين اثنين. الأول أن مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية كان جزءا من عملية سلام قائمة على فكرة التقسيم ومقتصرة على فهم وستفالي للسيادة، مفهوم مبني على هياكل إمبريالية ترسخ فكرة الهيمنة السياسية بدلا من مفاهيم العدالة والمساءلة والمساواة في تحديد مهام وصلاحيات أي دولة. ثانيا، مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية تم إنشاؤه على هيكل استعماري صهيوني مستمر ومتوسع، فلم يحاول مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية تفكيك الاستعمار الصهيوني بل قبل بالتعايش به، وبالتالي لم يكن بإمكانه إيقاف المستوطنات الإسرائيلية أو حماية المدنيين الفلسطينيين كما رأينا على مدار 30 سنة الماضية، وكما نرى اليوم مع حرب الإبادة على غزة. إن القبول الرسمي الفلسطيني بالصهيونية سمح بامتداد الاستعمار العنصري في كل فلسطين، وأدى إلى توسيع الانقسام والتفتت السياسي والاجتماعي الفلسطيني، وأوشك بتهميش القضية الفلسطينية وتفريغها من فحواها الأساسي وهدفها المركزي، ألا وهو الحرية وحق تقرير المصير والعدالة. من الضروري إذن أن نواجه ونقبل اليوم بأن مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية أدى دوره التاريخي، وأن هذا الدور قد انتهى. لقد أثبت مشروع الدولة الفلسطينية أو مشروع إنشاء دولة فلسطينية في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة أنه لعب دورا تاريخيا مهما، لكن دوره التاريخي انحصر في كونه أداة لتأكيد الوجود السياسي الفلسطيني وليس إلى تحقيق استقلال والتحرر كما كان يأمل الكثيرون، لأنه ظل محصورا في إطار منظومة استعمارية لم يحاول لا المجتمع الدولي ولا أي أو القرارات الدولية أن تفككه. السؤال إذن كيف لنا أن ننهي الاستعمار ونحقق التحرر من الآن فصاعدا؟ السؤال الذي يواجه القضية الفلسطينية اليوم هو كيف يمكن لنا أن نفكك المشروع العنصري الاستيطاني بتحويل الواقع الدولة الواحدة العنصرية التي فرضتها إسرائيل على مدار 30 سنة القائمة، هيكل أبارتايدي، كيف نحوله من هذا الهيكل العنصري إلى هيكل سياسي جديد أو دولة جديدة تضمن الحقوق الفلسطينية وحقوق كل من يسكن على هذه الأرض بعدل ومساواة. في رأيي من الضروري اليوم العودة إلى مشروع الدولة الديمقراطية التي طرحته منظمة التحرير ال71، والذي نادى بتكوين دولة ديمقراطية تشمل كل سكان فلسطين من يهود ومسيحيين ومسلمين، وتضمن حقوقهم الوطنية بالتساوي، ولكن آخذين في الحسبان المستجدات التي طرأت على القضية الفلسطينية إلى يومنا هذا وفي أعقاب الحرب على غزة، أي استحالة التعايش أو التهادن مع الصهيونية. لكن أيضا من الضروري إعادة صياغة مشروع الدولة الواحدة من تحديد شكله الدستوري الذي لم يعرف ببرنامج ال71، وتحديد الآلية السياسية لتبني وترويج هذه الدولة، وكيف سنتعامل مع وجود 7 مليون يهودي إسرائيلي يعيشون في فلسطين التاريخية، يساوي عددهم عدد الفلسطينيين القانتين على أراضيهم. في رأيي هناك 3 خطوات أساسية يجب أخذها لكي نتخطى فكرة التقسيم وفكرة الدولتين، مشروع الدولتين الذي فشل، ونطالب بدولة واحدة ديمقراطية تبني على الرصيد الدولي الذي اعترف بحق الفلسطيني في تقرير المصير وتنهي الاستعمار. الأول، هناك أول خطوة هو الإدراك بأن حل الدولتين يمدد الاستعمار الصهيوني ولا ينهيه. مثل هذا الإدراك لا يعني التنازل عن الاعتراف الدولي بالدولة الفلسطينية، بل يتطلب أن نقبل أن هذا الاعتراف الدولي يؤكد ويحمي حق تقرير المصير، لكن ممارسة هذا الحق لا ينحصر في تحقيق دويلة فلسطينية في الضفة الغربية وغزة، بل يمكن أن يمارس من خلال دولة كونفدرالية أو دولة ثنائية القومية أو دولة واحدة، وكل ذلك يتطلب أن نوضح الإطار الدستوري لدولة ديمقراطية واحدة. ثانياً، لابد لنا من إعادة إحياء مركزية منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية مؤسسة تمثيلية فاعلة تشمل الفلسطينيين داخل فلسطين وخارجها، ويتطلب ذلك أيضاً إجراء انتخابات جديدة تسمح لكل القوى السياسية وخاصة الشباب أن تتمثل فيها، ويتم نقاش شعبي حول مشروع التحرر الفلسطيني، مشروع الدولة الديمقراطية وشكله الدستوري والتحديات التي تواجهه. ثالثاً، لابد لنا من تعريف الإطار الدستوري لهذه الدولة. هل ستكون كونفدرالية أو ثنائية القومية أو دولة ديمقراطية ذات قومية واحدة تحمي الحقوق الفردية والجماعية لكل مواطنيها بغض النظر عن إثنيتهم؟ إن المحك التي تجد القضية الفلسطينية نفسها فيه اليوم قد يجعل فكرة إنشاء دولة كونفدرالية في فلسطين التاريخية اقتراح ربما واقعي أو أكثر واقعية من أي حل آخر، لأن مثل هذا الاتحاد الكونفدرالي يبني على الاعتراف الدولي لدولة فلسطين ودولة إسرائيل، كما يؤكد حقيقة وجود اقتصاد واحد فلسطين بني على مدار العقود ال7 الأخيرة، لكن مع الإصرار على تغيير هياكله الغير متكافئة. ومثل هذا الاتحاد الكونفدرالي سيسمح بحماية وتحقيق حق العودة للشعب واللاجئين الفلسطينيين كما أقره قرار 194. قد يجادل الكثيرون أن مثل هذا الاقتراح لن تقبل به إسرائيل وبالتالي ليس عملي، لكن هذا الرفض الإسرائيلي يجب أن لا يكون العذر لعدم التفكير في كيف لنا أن نعرض مشروعا تحرري في فلسطين اليوم. في رأيي أي مشروع تحرري بعد الحرب على غزة يتطلب منا مناقشة فلسطينية واسعة وإحياء منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية ومعالجة 3 قضايا مفاهيمية مركزية. الأولى، هناك حاجة ماسة إلى إعادة صياغة العلاقة بين مفهوم الأمة والدولة والابتعاد عن التمسك بالدولة القومية كهدفا سياسيا، فالدولة القومية قاصرة عن حماية المواطنة المتساوية، كما ذكر العديد من المناظرين السياسيين مثل حنا أرنت. نحن بحاجة إلى إعادة صياغة مفهوم الأمة والقومية من خلال إبعادها عن منحاها الإثني أو العرقي، والتفكير على أن الدولة هيكل وإطار قانوني يمكن أن يشمل ويمثل أكثر من قومية طالما كان ديمقراطيا وليس نظاما استبداديا أو عرقيا يعطي أولوية لمجموعة على حساب الأخرى. التحدي المفاهيمي الثاني الذي نحتاج معالجته هو إعادة التعريف بما نعنيه بإنهاء الاستعمار. إنهاء الاستعمار هو سيرورة وليس فقط غاية، ويستلزم إنهاء الانقسام الفلسطيني وإنهاء كل أشكال الاستبداد بما في ذلك الاستبداد الأبوي والاقتصادي والعنصري في داخل المجتمع الإسرائيلي والفلسطيني. أما التحدي الثالث الذي يجب على أي حل سياسي واقعي بديل لحل الدولتين أن يتطرق إليه هو تعريف كيف سنتعامل، تحديد شكله الديمقراطي، وكيف سنتعامل مع اختلافاتنا السياسية والإثنية والاقتصادية في فلسطين. الطريق أمامنا لا يزال طويلا وصعبا، في ظل خاصة في ظل استمرار الانقسام السياسي والدور العربي في محاولة تصفية المقاومة بدل حمايتها. لكن هذه الحرب أظهرت إصرار الفلسطينيين على البقاء على أراضيهم، وعلى أهمية المقاومة الفلسطينية، وأيضا على مركزية القضية الفلسطينية محليا وإقليميا ودوليا، وعلى استحالة تصفية القضية، تصفية يرفضها الشعب الفلسطيني ويصدها بشجاعة وثمن باهظ. لابد لنا أن نعيد تعريف مشروعنا الوطن الفلسطيني بمطالبة بدولة ديمقراطية تحمي وحدة الشعب والأرض والقضية الفلسطينية، وتحرر كل من هو على فلسطين، يحمي حق العودة لكل من هجر من فلسطين. شكرا جزيلا.
نشكر الدكتورة ليلى، وللأسف هي مش معنا اليوم، وكمان هذا التقديم كان مسجل، فإذا في حدا عنده أسئلة ممكن يتواصل معاها. وكمان أنا بأسف إنه هي مش معانا، لأنه في الكثير من النقاط اللي ممكن نطرحها بعدين بالنقاش. يارا ومهند ممكن نحكي عنها. سوف أنتقل للدكتورة يارا هواري، ستحدثنا عن المرأة الفلسطينية في النضال نحو صياغة إطار جديد للتحرر. الدكتورة يارا هي مديرة مشاركة للشبكة، شبكة السياسات الفلسطينية. عملت سابقا زميلة سياساتية للشبكة في فلسطين ومحللة رئيسية فيها. دكتورة يارا حاصلة على الدكتوراه في سياسة الشرق الأوسط من جامعة أكستر، حيث درست مساقات مختلفة لطلاب مرحلة البكالوريوس، ولا تزال زميلة بحثية فخرية في الجامعة. يركز عملها الأكاديمي على دراسات السكان الأصليين والتاريخ الشفوي، وهي معلقة سياساتية تكتب لوسائل إعلامية عديدة مثل The Guardian, Foreign Policy والجزيرة الإنجليزية. تفضلي دكتورة يارا، معك 20 دقيقة.
شكرا ماي. صباح الخير. My paper today broadly addresses the history of Palestinian women in the struggle, and then it's going to delve more in depth about recent Palestinian feminist movements which have put forward a new framework for liberation, namely a decolonial feminist one that places liberation for all at the center. And so for the purpose of time, I'm not going to focus too much on the history, but rather I'm going to present two recent movements that I use as a case study in this work. Palestinian women have always been politicized individuals and part and parcel of the national liberation struggle, and yet many patriarchal narratives position them simply as wives, sisters, or mothers of fighters, martyrs, and leaders. In other words, defined solely by the relationships to men in the struggle. And yet, even a cursory look back through history and historiography reveals a more complex and independent relationship with politics and political organizing, where they too show up as fighters, martyrs, and leaders. And whilst many historians have failed to document this adequately, and in some cases intentionally so, there are many Palestinian women scholars adopting feminist methodologies who have done so. For example, Ilan Kutub's contribution on the Palestinian women's movement, Islah Hajjad's work on women's activism, and the tensions between nationalism, secularism, and Islamism. Rima Hamami's scholarship on the participation of women in the labor force and political realm. Nahla Abdo's work on Palestinian women political prisoners and the struggle within the Israeli political system. And last but not least, Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, extensive work on the intersections between gendered violence and settler colonialism. And notably, Nadira was recently arrested by the Israeli regime for stating the genocidal intentions of the Zionist project in Gaza. So these works and many others assert undeniably that Palestinian women have always been present and active at crucial political and national moments. And not only that they dispel Orientalist and essentialist assumptions about Palestinian women and unpack the political and ideological tensions between feminism, nationalism, and anti-colonial struggle that Palestinian women have often had to navigate. And indeed, Palestinian women have long had to contend with participating in a liberation struggle that simultaneously marginalizes them from full participation. The level of participation of Palestinian women, of course, has not followed an upward trajectory, as one might assume. Rather, it's gone through ups and downs, and it's reflected wider societal trends in social norms and political transformations. So this morning, rather than detail this chronology of feminist struggle, I'm going to focus on unpacking feminism, Palestinian feminism, as both an analytical lens and a political project, and in particular, the recent re-emergence of decolonial Palestinian feminism. And this paper of mine has been particularly inspired by the scholarships of women I previously mentioned, but also the work of Sara Hmoud, Wala al-Qaysiyya, and Nada Ilya. So just to give you an example, Sara Hmoud describes decolonial Palestinian feminism as the following: an analytic and praxis rooted in women's resistance histories from the turn of the 19th century, when Palestinians first resisted Zionist settlers, to the changing Palestinian women's resistance movements through the First and Second Intifadas, the struggle against the Palestinian Authority, and neoliberalism for queer liberation, and in relation and parallel interconnected movements in the diaspora. And so today, as I mentioned, I'm going to present two examples of more recent Palestinian feminist organizing and how they embodied and continue to embody this kind of decolonial Palestinian feminism in terms of both ideology and praxis. And so the two examples I'm going to talk about are Tal'at and the Palestinian Feminist Collective. I'll refer to it as PFC from here in. And the former was a movement that arose in cities across Palestine in 2019, and the latter is a collective that was established by Palestinian women in the US a couple of years after. So the catalyst for the emergence of Tal'at was in August 2019, when a young Palestinian woman, Isra Ghraib, was killed by her family members in Bethlehem. Isra was initially beaten at home and then finally beaten to death in hospital, where her cries for help were ignored by the hospital staff, deliberately so. The brutality of the murder at the hands of her family and the institutional complicity from the hospital enraged many Palestinian women and resulted in the establishment of Tal'at. In Arabic, as I'm sure you're all aware, Tal'at means to step out or go out, and the name captures the frustration of Palestinian women not only being excluded from the liberation struggle, but also facing violence and restrictions from within the community. On the 26th of September 2019, over a month after Isra's killing, women from cities across Palestine, including Ramallah, Haifa, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Gaza City, hit the streets in rage under the banner of Tal'at, and with the slogan, "There is no free homeland without free women." With this slogan, they rejected the notion that violence towards women within the Palestinian community could be separated from the wider context of Israeli settler colonialism. They pushed back against Western and local media framings of their movement as a protest against honor killings, and insisted on an intersectional and nuanced understanding of the context in which Palestinian women live and struggle. That is, that intercommunal violence towards women and girls is part and parcel of the settler colonial reality. The slogan was also reflective of the disillusionment with the Palestinian National Project and the inclusion of women and feminism in it, particularly following the Oslo Accords, which transformed the Palestinian National Project from its revolutionary decolonial origins to that of a state-building project. And this is, of course, not to say that prior to Oslo, the Palestinian National Project was one that adopted radical feminist thought. Quite the opposite. In fact, women have always been marginalized from the struggle, and even among the so-called radical left, it was common to hear that feminism was a secondary goal to liberation rather than being part and parcel of it. And indeed, there's the whole wealth of literature that dissects this tension between nationalism and feminism over the decades. But the fact remains that the Oslo Accords had a serious impact of further marginalization of women from the political project, which is often whitewashed by false indicators of inclusion, such as gender quotas in ministries and the creation of women's units in the security services. And so Tal'at's slogan of "there can be no free homeland without free women" aptly places women at the center of the liberation discourse. and in of itself challenges Palestinian nationalism. Following the initial demonstration against the killing of Isra, the movement established decentralized groups in Haifa, Jerusalem, Ramallah, and beyond. These groups grounded themselves with shared values of decolonial radical feminism and distinguished themselves from NGOs and other civil society actors by asserting that their call was not for institutional reform, but to deepen their understanding of the intertwined relationship between colonization and the manifestations of social oppression. Their ambitious goal was to bring Palestinian women together under one umbrella in a decentralized and also defragmented space of feminist political activism. Over several years, the movement's activists participated in political demonstrations. They were at the forefront of what was known as the Unity Intifada in 2021, and other activities around social issues, including that of political prisoners and community efforts during the COVID pandemic. While the group is no longer active, it sparked a new wave of feminist political organizing, and its legacy continues to be a significant source of inspiration. And indeed, in March 2021, the Palestinian Feminist Collective, the PFC, a US-based movement, launched its first campaign, Palestine is a Feminist Issue, and they themselves said that they were heavily inspired by Talat. The PFC called for the advancement of Palestinian feminism as a liberatory philosophy and practice necessary to create the world we want to live in. They are still active to this day. They're mostly Palestinian and Arab feminist activists, organizers, practitioners, creators, thinkers, scholars, all based on Turtle Island, the unceded lands of North America. In the summer of 2021, during the Unity Intifada and the Sheikh Jarrah protests, in which feminist organizing played a key role, as I mentioned, the PFC wrote a love letter to sisters struggling in Palestine, and I want to share just a small snippet with you all this morning. We stand with you as you resist this masculinized and militarized colonization. We share in your pain from this renewed assault on Palestinian life and land. We are enraged as settlers wreak havoc and call for the death of our people. We stand vigilant as you withstand airstrikes in Gaza and stun grenades, tear gas, skunk water, rubber bullets, and the desecration of our sacred sites in Jerusalem, no less during the month of Ramadan. We stand with you as you resist the media's violent erasure of the Palestinian struggle. Your labor has taught us for generations. Palestine is a feminist issue. Love guides our methodology for liberation, and we affirm life and implore feminists everywhere to speak up, organize, and join the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Now, in this letter, the PFC highlights that Palestinian radical and decolonial feminism recognizes the centrality of anti-colonial struggle and the complex gender underpinnings of the Zionist project and its effects on Palestinian women. And to this day, the PFC continues to be one of the crucial actors in the Palestine solidarity movement in the US. Now, for both Talat and the PFC, Palestinian feminism is as much an analytical lens as it is a political project. And in this sense, it's not only about focusing on the reality of Palestinian women and bettering that reality, but rather it's about understanding the interconnectedness of gendered violence and settler colonialism. And inevitably, this encourages an inwards reflection on the Palestinian liberation movement. Throughout history, the nationalist Palestinian rhetoric around women's emancipation has, at best, taken a pragmatic approach. That is, that women, as half of the population, must be included in the struggle in order to win. The logic here is a simple one. The more people, the more successful the revolution or the liberation struggle. And there is a long history of other revolutionary and liberation struggles taking a similar approach. A much more common approach, however, has been to dismiss women's emancipation as a secondary issue to be fully dealt with after liberation. And in both instances, Palestinian women are treated as inherently inferior to their male comrades. Even in spaces outside of the corrupt political institutions of the PA, the veneer of inclusion and quotas for Palestinian women continue to be the modus operandi. The absence of a commitment from the liberation movement to place women's liberation at the forefront of the struggle places an unfair burden on Palestinian women themselves to push it to the forefront, which they have actively done so for over 7 decades. And so I argue that movements like Talat and the Palestinian Feminist Collective exemplify the potential of decolonial feminist praxis to reshape the liberation struggle by challenging both patriarchal nationalism and settler colonialism at the same time. They present a liberatory vision rooted in justice, equality, and true emancipation for all Palestinians. And importantly, their ideology and political thinking is not relegated to an abstract realm. Rather, it's rooted in a grassroots praxis which sees their members at the forefront of protests, community actions, and even incarcerated in Israeli jails. These movements have marked a new dawn for the Palestinian feminist movement. Once again, they have attempted to force a revolutionary feminist discourse onto the political agenda. Thank you.
شكرا يارا. قبل ما نفتح المجال، طبعا مهند رح يحكي، بس قبل ما نفتح المجال للأسئلة أنا رح أحط سؤال سريع. أنت حكيتي إنه الحراك الثوري الفلسطيني سواء قبل أوسلو أو بعدين بمفهوم الدولة والإنكلوجن ستراتيجيز تبعت السلطة مش إقصائي بطريقة، ولكن طبعا في بيستعمل كوتاز وبيستخدم ناريتيف معينة أو خطاب معين إنه النساء جزء من الحراك الثوري أو التحرري. بس كمان في زي accusations مش ضد هاي الحراكات سواء كانت طلعات أو PFC إنه هي حراكات إقصائية بناء على المناطقية والطبقية، أو هي كتير متركزة في المدن ولا طبقة معينة اللي هي الطبقة الوسطى أو ما أعلى من الوسطى، للصبايا اللي هن يمكن بدهم يطلعوا من مجال الNGOs ولكن هم لسه متصلين فيه، وفي لهم بعض المميزات اللي هو يقصي نساء أخريات بفلسطين، وخاصة مثلا PFC اللي هو شتات، ومش شتات مخيمات ولكن شتات له مميزات سواء يعني passport privileges أو privileges تعليمية أو يعني عندها مصادر اجتماعية واقتصادية. فبس هاي النقاط اللي ممكن نطرحها بعدين بس خلي مهند يحكي. طيب، المتحدث الأخير معنا هو الدكتور مهند عياش. الدكتور مهند هو أستاذ علم الاجتماع في جامعة أنا مش شايف لأني مش حاطة نظاراتي سوري في جامعة مونتريال بكندا، وهو أيضا محلل سياسات في شبكة السياسات الفلسطينية، وهو مؤلف كتاب Hermeneutics of Violence. Hermeneutics is a word اللي عادة نقرأها بس بنحاول إن ما نحكيها، بس شكرا مهند خلتني أحكيها. وتم إصدار الكتاب في العام 2019، وسيصدر لك كتاب بعنوان Lordship and Liberation in Palestine Israel. وشاركت في تحرير كتابين، وأيضا أنت مؤلف للعديد من المقالات في المجلات والفصول في الكتب. مهند سيحدثنا اليوم عن السيادة وعدم التقسيم والنضال من أجل التحرير ما بعد الاستعمار لفلسطين. 20 دقيقة، تفضل.
شكرا ماي، صباح الخير. والله كنت ناوي انه اجرب اقدم بالعربي بس ما صح ليش وقت احضر حالي، فسامحوني راح احكي بالانجليزي. This paper is more theoretical and aspirational in its analysis. By aspirational, I mean it does not necessarily provide a blueprint for liberation, but presents a theoretical analysis of the path towards liberation and what might different paths produce as liberation, decolonial liberation for the Palestinian cause. It theorizes two general paths that are common in the history of decolonial struggles. Let me be very clear from the outset. There is no decolonial struggle against settler colonialism and imperialism that doesn't involve both armed resistance and unarmed resistance. And of course, there's also discussions about the blurry line between them. You're always going to have both. There's no such thing as purely armed resistance. There's no such thing as purely unarmed resistance. But I contend theoretically that we can, as scholars, and we do as scholars, and I'll bring up some examples of that shortly, distinguish between a resistance or a struggle for liberation in which one or the other was emphasized more as what I call the guiding principle of action. So in some cases, unarmed resistance is the guiding principle of action, what comes to define the resistance movement. And in some cases, it's armed resistance that comes to define it. Of course, again, in the contextual analysis, these theoretical lines are not always going to be clear. There's not going to be an easy distinction between them. But we do, as scholars, yet do that work. And again, I'll bring up some examples shortly. Generally speaking, what I mean when I say unarmed resistance is going to be the guiding principle of action, this is where you're going to have the movement in its practice, in its aspiration, and in its sort of overall image and the narrative around it will involve the withdrawal of participation from systems of settler, colonial, and imperial power as the primary guiding principle of action. Withdrawal of participation refers to general strikes, labor strikes, acts of refusal, refusing to pay taxes, plenty of examples of that throughout history, in Palestine and beyond. And the mobilizing and organization structures will tend to be highly participatory, meaning a large number of people will be participating in the mobilization practices and in the organizational structures of the resistance movement. In this scenario, you still have armed resistance. Again, there's no such thing as purely one and another, but it tends to appear in very tactical ways. It doesn't become the guiding principle of action. It appears in very tactical ways, including, by the way, ways that are not just self-defense, but put pressure on the imperial and settler colonial structures. In the other scenario, where armed resistance is more the guiding principle of action, you still have sometimes mass participation, but it tends to be always directed towards enabling the armed resistance. So you have mass mobilization, but it's done to generate capital, as little as it might be in some cases, but still generate capital for the resistance movement, whether that's securing food or health or intelligence gathering and any of those kinds of things. But mass mobilization happens always towards not necessarily withdrawal of participation from imperial and settler colonial structures, but in generating capital so that the resistance can keep going. In fact, in a lot of cases, there's no withdrawal of participation, because you need to generate capital from somewhere, and that's usually dependent, in a lot of cases, on imperial and settler colonial structures. You don't see too much withdrawal of participation in that case. Again, these are theoretical guideline, conceptual tools. It's not going to be easy when you try to make the case in specific cases, but we do that anyway. So, for example, in the South African struggle against apartheid, it's obviously a combination of both, armed and unarmed resistance. But during the moment of the dismantlement of apartheid, it was the guiding principle of action, I think most scholars would argue, was unarmed resistance. So, refusal to pay taxes, they refused to pay rents in public housing, which is what the majority of people were living in, labor strikes, which themselves also have acts of violence in it, right? The strike committees, you got to make sure people don't participate in the structure. Some people still will, so you got to figure out a way to not let that happen. Sometimes that means the use of violence. And in that case in South Africa, violence was still used, armed resistance was used mostly as a tactic, trying to attack the economic infrastructure of the apartheid state and so on. An example of decolonization struggle where armed resistance was more the guiding principle of action, the Algerians against French settler colonialism, and many other examples in the struggle against colonialism and imperialism. In my view, I think that when the armed resistance takes the center stage, when it is the guiding principle of action, there are some concerning signs that lead to what I would call partial decolonial liberation. So it can still lead to liberation, but I would call it partial. And the reason I call it partial is that there isn't that mass withdrawal of participation from settler colonial and imperial structures. So some of the reasons include why that happens is that the nature of the activity itself, armed liberation struggle, tends to be focused on removing the enemy, not necessarily the structures of power. And we've seen this in a lot of decolonial struggles and what the post-colonial state looks like afterwards. Another reason, and there are others, but I'll just focus on two here, it tends to happen through hierarchical structures, largely hierarchical structures in the armed resistance. And it's very difficult to dismantle those in the post-liberation moment, as we see in many post-colonial authoritarian regimes today. You know, there are certain dynamics to the use of violence, I believe, that suggest that it becomes very difficult in the moment of liberation to avoid the rise of authoritarian regimes, precisely because violence was so effective at overthrowing the settler colonial and imperial regimes. It becomes implanted in the political structure of the emerging state that violence works, violence can be used to build liberation. You tend to find, you know, a very slippery slope of groups then coming to the conclusion that, since violence was the only means of overthrowing the imperial and settler colonial regime, violence is the only way of maintaining the counter-revolutionaries or the counter-movement from the imperial structures, and so on and so forth. So it tends to maintain its presence in the political and social structures of the post-colonial states. But like I said, this still qualifies as partial liberation. If it means the end of Israeli settler colonialism, it's still a liberation. It's just partial because what emerges out of that is likely to maintain some of those settler colonial structures. They will not be challenged. Just, you know, we shouldn't expect that to look different in Palestine than it did in Algeria or any other place. It fails to create an alternative structure to imperialism and settler colonialism, and what I would argue, the really big picture here is it does not present an alternative to the world of colonial modernity. In contrast, when the guiding principle of action is unarmed resistance, by its nature, for that to work, it needs mass withdrawal of participation. And mass withdrawal of participation necessitates mass mobilization structures and a different kind of organizational structure to take hold for mass mobilization to actually work. Now, that doesn't guarantee you full decolonial liberation, as we see in this case of South Africa. Which has failed to properly decolonize. You can see today, you know, racial, economic, and spatial segregation and apartheid are alive and well in South Africa. Nothing is guaranteed here, but I believe that this path gives you a better shot because precisely in the resistance moment itself, you are creating structures, politically and socially, that are alternative to the world of colonial modernity. And I think that you see two big examples of that in Palestinian resistance, of mass withdrawal of participation in the 1930s and in the First Intifada. And I think in the First Intifada you have the popular committees as an excellent example of that kind of mass mobilization that I'm kind of referring to. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that women and the women's movement was a critical aspect of those popular committees in the First Intifada. Without the women's movement's years of experience at a different kind of mobilizing system and a organizational structure, the popular committees don't look the way that they ended up looking in the First Intifada. And some of the scholars that Yara mentioned are key in making that argument, and I think in a very convincing way. But to me, those popular committees, precisely, you know, for example, because the women's movement had sort of perfected the art of mobilization across class, region, political faction, and of course gender, they managed to mobilize greater masses into the movement, and then the organizational structure itself had a very non-hierarchical structure to it. So even though there's a leadership that emerges in the popular committee, you know, the united leadership of the uprising, I can't remember the exact term off the top of my head right now, but that leadership system never looked like a centralized authority, with a clear hierarchy over the people. It was, if you read their communiques, for example, they were always referring back to the power of the people and the ability of the people to participate in self-governance, in self-rule, in really the sovereignty of the people. And organizing the protest actions and the withdrawal of participation and so on and so forth. They were critical organs of the first Intifada. So to me, when you have that kind of mobilizing structure, organizational structure, you are creating something that looks different than the modern nation state of colonial modernity. And when you have that in the resistance moment, you are much more likely to carry that into the liberated moment and actually create an alternative to colonial modernity. Now, here I want to sort of shift the discussion as to some of the obstacles that stand in the way of Palestinian liberation, regardless of which path is taken. Because the Palestinian people, like I said, have at the very least achieved this withdrawal of participation on a mass level in this mass organizing and the creation of what I theorize as decolonial sovereignties at least twice in the history on a mass scale. These things are ongoing, of course, on small scales all the time, but on a mass scale they happen twice, which is very difficult to accomplish. When it comes to, for example, scholarship on whether you want to call it social movements or revolutionary change, this mass withdrawal of participation is the cream of the crop. It's the hardest thing to do. For the Palestinian people to do it twice in their long history is quite astonishing. Yet it didn't work either time in achieving liberation. So sometimes you have the contextual factors so stacked up against you that you can achieve again, the hardest thing to do and still not get your liberation. That contextual difficulties, of course, historically have looked very similar to what we face today, but I'll focus a little bit more on the situation that we find ourselves in today. Today, with everybody focused on the question of the state, let's understand that the most common diplomatic discourse on the solution for the Palestinian cause is the two-state solution. Whether we agree with it or not, like it or not, most diplomatic international discourse still looks at the two-state solution as the only real solution, and that's the discourse that is in fact supported by the Palestinian Authority itself. Countries around the world, including South Africa, China, the Arab world, when they talk about the solution, they just go two-state solution, that's it. Let's always sort of remind ourselves what that means. Because although we all know what the facts of that are in this room, I think a lot of these facts have we've lost the gravity of what they actually mean because we've said them so many times. Two-state solution mean we've given up on 78% of Palestine. It's the biggest capitulation, really, to the settler colonial regime that you can imagine. And most people, advance it from, this is a realist perspective and that's all we can get. But to me, that's at the very best, if it's not comprador class, at the very best, it's an appeasement strategy that clearly does not work. And I think that we need to work harder to shift that discourse among the global South. And to explain to the global South and to ourselves as well, and the Arab world in clearer terms, why it is that this discourse of the two-state solution is in fact appeasement to settler colonialism and imperialism, and will never lead to any kind of real decolonial liberation for Palestine. So how do we make that case? Part of what we're seeing in this moment is that many countries in the global South are again using the language of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism to talk about Palestine in official state discourse at official international institutions like the International Court of Justice. That has kind of disappeared for a long time. It came back over the last year or so. And I think we need to take advantage of that and push that line and remind everyone that the Palestinian struggle is an anti-imperialist struggle. is an anti-colonial struggle, is part and parcel of the unfinished project of decolonization against this age of colonial modernity. And we need to explain that any sort of discussion of a two-state solution is precisely ensnaring the global South back into that colonial worldview, and one that can only benefit ultimately American imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism. So how do we do that? I think for one, we remind everyone that the Israelis and the Americans do not want even a two-state solution. This should be so obvious now, but somehow it still isn't. Even if you say, the only realistic solution is two-state solution along 1967 borders, we have to remind them. Nobody in Israel or the US, or the West for that matter, is interested in seeing that realized. At most, what Israel is willing to accept is give the Palestinians self-administration, not self-determination, not sovereignty, self-administration in about 5% to 8% of historic Palestine. That's it. The rest will be under exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty, and those 5 to 8%, because it would only be self-administration, would in effect be under Israeli Jewish sovereignty. So we'd have to remind everyone that that is the case. And so, okay, so what is the solution then? As Leyla talked about, and others, many talk about the one-state solution, democratic solution, and so on. But in my view, we should shift the discussion to the question of sovereignty. And not necessarily the question of the state. I can see different kind of one-state solution models that Leyla mentioned and is documented in her book, no-state solution models. I can see many of them working in the context where we shift the discussion to sovereignty. Why shift it to the sovereignty? To me, sovereignty, we should not understand it in the classic in the shape that it took in the age of colonial modernity, which is the establishment of the centralized, indivisible, absolute centralized authority. But rather, we should take the word sovereignty back to something that existed before the age of colonial modernity, and something that we should aspire to beyond the age of colonial modernity. To me, the concept speaks to a fundamental questions about human beings' understanding of their relationship to the land and their relationship to each other. And if we take the discussion to those more fundamental questions on decolonial grounds, then we can start to imagine what we would construct as a decolonial alternative in terms of the social, political, and economic systems under which we live, and be more assured that that can lead us to a proper decolonized world. What that's going to look like, I cannot give you the blueprint for. I have some ideas that I can theorize based on historical practices, but it should be a communal project. And I think that kind of discussion about sovereignty could reignite the global South's interest in some more fundamental questions about transforming our world. And ultimately, to really decolonize, to really have Palestinian decolonial liberation, you're going to need three things: a decolonization of Palestinian leadership structures, a decolonization of the state structures in the global South, and a decolonization of the international order itself. I don't know how the three can transform and what pattern they should follow in all of that. But what I do know, and what I think we should be very forcefully making as our message to the world, is that those three transformations have to all happen for real decolonization to take place, and that will be good, not just for the Palestinians, but for the majority of the world's population. Thank you.
شكرا مهند، شكرا لالتزامك بالوقت بالضبط على الدوت. في كم من نقطة كنت بحب أطرحها قبل ما نفتح المجال للأسئلة، اللي هو حركة المقاطعة. هل بتعتبرها mass withdrawal مش بس بفلسطين ولكن internationally، وشو بتحس دورها اللي بتلعبه في حاليا الحراك الثوري بفلسطين وخارج فلسطين للتحرر؟ الموضوع الثاني اللي هو الحركات الثورية والتحررية اللي هي ما بتخضع لأطر مؤسسية مثل الحراك النسوي في فلسطين ما قبل أوسلو مثلا خلال الانتفاضة أو بثورة 36 أو ما بعدها. كيف بيتم استغلالهم أو they're being co-opted لما نصير نفكر بحل الدولة، سواء كانت الدولة الواحدة أو الدولتين أو الطروحات اللي حكيت عنها ليلى اللي هي بتضلها طروحات كولونيالية. يعني حتى لما نفكر فيها يعني حل الدولة هو طرح كولونيالي لسه، أو هو جزء من ال partial decolonization أو اللي بخلينا في نفس شرك الاستعمار. فهدول النقطتين اللي حبيت أطرحهم. هلأ بنقدر نفتح المجال للأسئلة والملاحظات. يمكن ناخد 3 questions. Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do that. I'll use my position of power.
Just as a reminder, May's question was about the critique of these feminist movements being exclusionary and classist. And I think this was a criticism that both Tal'at and PFC were and are very aware about, and I think they dominated the discussions, and I mean that in a very genuine and healthy way. I'll speak mostly to Tal'at because that's what I can speak to with personal experience. Tal'at was a movement that was born in Palestinian cities, predominantly Haifa and Ramallah. And the women involved were predominantly from the cities, but also from villages in the sort of surrounding areas that had come to live in the cities. But let's say they were, it was predominantly made up of urbanized women and a mix of working class, lower middle class and middle class, the majority of whom did not have European passport privilege. I was perhaps the exception, or not anymore, Brexit. But having, said that, I think living in Ramallah and Haifa inevitably places you in a place of privilege regardless of class, because you have more access to resources and services, and you certainly don't face the brunt of Israeli settler colonial violence. And so, as I said, this topic was extensively discussed, and it was something that I think many of the women were very acutely aware of. And there were attempts to address this through understanding other feminist movements and struggles, particularly in the global south, who faced similar tensions, and actually having direct dialogue with them, including the Kurdish Revolutionary Women's Movement, which is actually spread across rural mountains, urban spaces, refugee camps, diasporic spaces in the West. Also various Latin American struggles, including the Zapatistas in Mexico, who originally came from rural spaces. It was also based on readings by Black radical feminists. And so with these discussions came a wealth of knowledge, but no clear answers. And so I think some of the questions that arose is how do we grapple with the fact that we were a movement that was born from Palestinian urban centers, which inherently makes it exclusionary, and how do we include women from more rural areas, but also from refugee camps, without doing so in a way that is tokenizing. And again, no clear answers. And so I think this tension will always exist within movements. I think that's something that we continue to have to grapple with. And interestingly, it was a tension that was very much exploited by the Palestinian Authority and by people who hate women and feminists, who accused Tal'at, specifically in Ramallah, of being funded by foreign agents, of receiving foreign funding. And of course, Tal'at was a movement that had no money and did not receive money. And it was because they classified that feminism as being a foreign feminism because it was decolonial and radical. So I didn't answer that question, but that was just a sort of glimpse into the sort of internal discussions within the movement.
Thank you, Yara. And as was said before, it's always a process, and the good thing is that we create these spaces for discussion other than actually giving answers that would be all actually exclusionary and will end the discussion. So thank you so much. Mehند?
Thank you, Mai. So when it comes to withdrawal of participation on the international level, absolutely that is necessary. So withdrawal of participation does two things. One, it weakens the imperial and settler colonial structures. Without your participation in them, they're much weaker. So it weakens them quite significantly. Two, it forces you to create alternative structures. You have no choice. If you're now no longer dependent on your economic, social, and political life on those structures, you have to create something else to take their place. So it forces people to innovate and create something new. And if it is based in these kind of, I said, mass mobilization structures and organizational structures, you have a better chance of creating something that is in fact alternative to those structures. So those two elements are both critical. And a global mass withdrawal of participation, of course, is going to be very difficult to do. But what you can do, I think, in our case, we have a sort of more specific, particular kind of withdrawal of participation that can lead to bigger effects. So I think what we can tell the world, which is, because it's based on reality, is that Israel is one of the critical imperial outposts for US imperialism. It generates enormous amounts of wealth and power for the US. When Biden has been saying for 30 years now that it's the greatest investment the US makes, he's not just talking, out of his you-know-what. He sees things on the inside that we don't see. He knows how much that investment, they spent billions, but he calls it an investment. They're getting billions in return. The role that Israel just played for American imperialism in Latin America is huge. It's not just in the region. This is one of its critical sources of power. So if we go to the global south and say, help us decolonize this area, it will weaken American power. That's a form of withdrawal of participation that the world can engage with right now. I understand that many people in the global south, not just their governments, but people, will say, we can't afford it. We can't afford a confrontation with the Americans. We're too economically dependent on them, and so we're too afraid of their military. All understandable things to say. I don't judge that. Okay, so weaken their imperial outpost. You'll put a real good dent into their power and gives you a better chance now to maneuver and recreate the international system and so on and so forth. So you can withdraw your participation by economically and politically isolating the Israeli state. To this date, nobody's doing that. Apart from the few countries that never did it in the first place, which are very few, nobody's really doing that. There needs to be a change in the international system, but we need these global south spaces to start to take decolonization as seriously as the Americans take imperialism. We're a long way away from that, and there are tremendous obstacles in its way. This is, I think, one path of withdrawal of participation that we can already communicate to the world today. We don't have to wait. I'm not saying it's easy, but we need to push this, I think, a line through. The second question, I just missed the beginning of it because I was distracted with the mic. What were you talking about in terms of who's going to get co-opted? Sorry.
The horizontal movements who are not institutionalized, like feminist movements in Palestine during the revolutionary time, like say the first intifada that you gave an example of, and how they were co-opted under the PA.
Yes.
So once the partial decolonization happens, these movements get co-opted within institutions for tokenization,
Yes.
like Yara was saying.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And Hamami calls that the NGOization. Tariq Tana has written on this as well. Nahla Abdo, who talks about how a lot of these feminist movements were basically told by funders, take the colonialism and occupation thing out and we'll give you money. So co-optation, I mean, that's, settler colonial and imperial power spreads not just through the gun, but through money, of course. And that's one of the huge problems, so that withdrawal of participation needs to be really firm when it commits to that, and that to me still is the best chance at avoiding that outcome. But again, it's not a guarantee. So in South Africa, there's massive withdrawal of participation, but at the moment of liberation, the Americans come and say, okay, lay off on economic, like ending of economic apartheid. If you don't, no funding from us. And their hands were forced. You could critique that today and all of that, but it's not an easy position to find yourself in as a liberation movement in that moment. But that's one of the hardest obstacles to overcome, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you very much, Yara and Mehند. We still have 45 minutes, so we'll open رح نفتح المجال للنقاش والأسئلة. ناخذهم 3-3. أوكي. So الأسئلة أول 3 أسئلة. تفضلي. لو سمحتي بس تعرفي عن حالك وتحكي لنا لمين السؤال إذا مش سؤال عام للثلاث متحدثين.
دكتورة آمنة بدران، جامعة القدس. للدكتور مهند، الحديث عن الاستراتيجيات المقاومة، احنا بنعرف انه الماس موفمنت، الماس موبيلايزيشن حصل في الانتفاضة الأولى، وكان في كادر وسيط والعمل على المستوى الجماهيري قادته الفصائل السياسية. لكن أوسلو أجت كحل تمثل في نهايته عملية احتواء لكل العمل الجماهيري وعملية ديموبيلايزيشن للسيفل سوسايتي الفلسطيني. هلا انتقلنا في الانتفاضة الثانية للعمل المسلح، والعمل المسلح برضه يعني استطاع انه يشتبك مع الاحتلال، لكن موازين القوى لم تحدث تغيير نوعي، ووصلنا لمرحلة طوفان الأقصى اللي أدى اليوم لإبادة في غزة. فالسؤال هون يعني الماس موبيلايزيشن تم إضعافها، والعمل المسلح وين وصلنا؟ السؤال اليوم وين؟ كيف ممكن إنه نعمل هذا الشيفت إن باور بحيث إنه نروح لمفاوضات حقيقية تغير في النتيجة؟ بدنا إحنا النتيجة ضمن الماتريكس أوف كنترول، مصفوفة السيطرة اللي بتقوم فيها إسرائيل، وطبعا أمريكا في ظهرها كشريك أساسي في هذه العملية للحفاظ على منظومة مصالحها في المنطقة. فبالتالي هو الموضوع موضوع مش فلسطين إسرائيلي، فلسطين إسرائيلي إقليمي دولي. طيب هون اليوم فلسطين، واليوم أنا باجي من القدس بقول طيب يعني إحنا مش قادرين نتحرك من هون لهون، بدنا 3 ساعات عبال ما نوصل الشغل، و3 لنرجع بكون خلصت النهار، عارف؟ فاليوم شو الالترناتيف بحيث انك تضلك في وطنك في اليوم اللي ترامب بيقول لمصر والاردن استقبل الفلسطينيين؟ هذه اخر الاخبار. احنا اليوم بنحكي عن قضايا وصلنا لمرحله اللي الاسرائيلي بيشوف بعد الابراهاميك اكورد انه بيقدر يحسم المعركه، هو بده يحسم على الارض الوجود الفلسطيني بتفريغ ما يمكن ابعاد ما يمكن ابعاده. فوين هون القضيه اللي يمكن اليوم المصيريه هي تقويه الناس والبقاء وبناء منافذ مش بس الصمود والصمود المقاوم في ظل كل هاي هذا، بعيدا عن كنا انا وياك يعني ممكن نكون قرانا النظريات السياسيه هاي، بس اليوم على الواقع شو الواحد بيقدر يعمل. القضيه الثانيه انت حكيت على ساوث افريكا. ساوث افريكا نقطة أساسية في استراتيجيات المقاومة كانت فض الشرعية عن ايديولوجية الابرتايد. واحنا خسرنا هاي النقطة، يعني احنا في قرار في الأمم المتحدة انه Zionism is a form of racism، لكن احنا خسرناها بعد مدريد، مؤتمر مدريد اللي تم سحب هذا القرار من قرارات الأمم المتحدة. اليوم بعد الإبادة في غزة أعتقد أنه اليوم ضروري أنه تكون أحد أهم مفاصل المقاومة هي فض الشرعية عن الصهيونية وديليجيتمايز زايونيزم، لأنه هي رأس الموضوع. إذا أنت أضعفتها وإذا أنت خلقت الكاونتر أو alternative narrative اللي هو بقول هون تكمن المشكلة، this is not democracy, this is not legitimate, يعني هون أنت بتعمل decolonization للفكرة. بعدين بنيجي بنقول how to undermine الستراكشرز اللي مرتبطة فيها. فبالتالي أنا بشوف هذه نقطة أساسية في صراعنا وفي يعني في نضالنا مع الصهيونية.
شكرا لك دكتورة. إذن سؤالين أو نقطتين. السؤال اللي بعده أي حدا؟ تفضل.
شكرا مي، يارا ومهند. أنا ليث حنبلي، باحث في مؤسسة الدراسات الفلسطينية. ملاحظة مع تساؤل، يعني يمكن ما يكونش في جواب واضح فبديش أفرضه كسؤال، يعني بس هيك نفكر مع بعض يمكن أكتر، خاصة يعني بعد السؤال اللي طرحتيه مي على يارا بالنسبة للحركات اللي تم انتقادها كأنها هي ممكن تكون إقصائية في محل ما. ويمكن هاد إشي يعني يمكن ما كانش في جواب واضح عند طلعات، لأنه برضه يعني طلعات حراك، هي مش إشي اللي كان يحاول يطرح مشروع كامل متكامل حزبي اللي يقدر يحكم ولا يقود الثورة كاملة. وشفنا هذا الإشي مش بس بالحراكات النسوية، شفناه بكل الحراكات وكل الحركات اللي حاولت تطلع في البلد من أوسلو لليوم، يعني بعد يعني إقصاء الأحزاب عن مبادئها الأيديولوجية اللي كانت عم بتحاول ترتب المجتمع على أساسها. فالتساؤل هو يعني يمكن برضو مهند يكون في لك يعني برضو أفكار عنه، وهو جزء من الأبحاث اللي برضو بعملها عن الحركات الصحية وتاريخها في دعم المقاومة أو المشاركة في المقاومة بالثورة الفلسطينية. إنه هل في عندنا مفر لما نحاول نفكر ب يعني withdrawal of participation أو الحركات الجماهيرية، ولا الحركات اللي بتحاول توجه البوصلة اتجاه إنه إحنا نزع الاستعمار برضو، يعني نزع الأبوية، يعني كل هاي الاصطفافات اللي عم نحاول نعملها من خلال حراكات. هل في مفر من إنه نحاول إنه يا إما تروح هذا الإشي لا حراك اللي يكون حزبي، إنه عن جد إنه نحاول نقاوم من خلال الأحزاب، أو إنه تحاول إنها تفرض حالها على الأحزاب إنه تغير من نهجها؟ هل في مفر من هذا المحل؟ هذا التساؤل دايما عندي. هل اليوم اتغيرت الآية؟ يمكن بالسبعينات كان واضح السؤال إنه بدك تشتغل، بدك تكون جزء من الأحزاب. اليوم إحنا جيل اللي اتربينا يعني إضعاف الأحزاب وتحييدها وشيطنتها برضو لمحل ما. يعني إحنا كنا يعني برضو لا ابعد عن الأحزاب لأنه صارت تاخذ مصاري وسخة، صارت 1 2 3. يعني في برضه يعني حتى باللي بده يحاول يفكر بطريقة كتير تقدمية وراديكالية إنه الأحزاب تم شيطنتها في محل ما، إنه هي بطلت نظيفة، بطلت مبدئية. ففي هذا الإشي برضه. بس هل في مفر؟ وإذا ما في مفر لازم السؤال اللي بعده يكون إنه طب فعلياً كيف ممكن نمارس هذا الإشي؟ وإحنا بنشوف إنه حتى أي حراك يعني قد النقطة بتم قمعه خلال أيام وأسابيع، إذا مش من قبل الاحتلال من قبل السلطة. فإنه إذا التحرك اللي على سنتي عم بتم قمعه فوراً، كيف بدنا نطمح لعمل حزبي في الوقت الحالي؟
شكراً لك. السؤال الثالث تفضل. لا بمايك عشان الترجمة لو سمحت.
طيب يعطيكم العافية. يعني حتى نحكي عن التحرر بالحالة الوطنية الفلسطينية يجب إعادة صياغة المعادلة الداخلية في المجتمع الفلسطيني، بمعنى أنه أوسلو رسم مسار عنوانه المفاوضات وسلطة تتحول إلى دولة. هذا انتهى في 4/5/99، وواضح من خلال ما بعد ذلك أن كل الممارسات الاحتلالية من استيطان وتهويد وكانتونات ومعازل وأخيرا الجنوسايد على قطاع غزة هو هدفه استكمال المشروع الصهيوني بإبادة الشعب الفلسطيني وتهجيره. وبالتالي الحديث عن أشكال التحرر الوطني هي أشكال متعددة وأشكال مشروعة جميعها، لكن كيف بدنا نخوض عملية التحرر الوطني في ظل بنية نظام ما زال يراهن على المفاوضات كمسيرة وحيدة وكمسار وحيد، وبالمقابل وهذا خطف الشعب الفلسطيني لأكثر من 30 سنة استخدموا الاحتلال كغطاء لتعميق الاستيطان وفرض منظومة معازل وبنتستنات، وفي نفس الوقت طوفان الأقصى رغم مشروعية الكفاح الوطني المسلح حسب القانون الدولي، لأننا لا نناقش الشرعية ولكن نناقش غياب حالة المشاركة الشعبية في صناعة أشكال التحرر الوطني، سواء بالشكل التفاوض النخبوي أو بالشكل المسلح النخبوي. هذان الشكلان اللي هم عكس بعضهم البعض، كيف في إمكانية أنهم يتكاملوا، وكيف في إمكانية نبدع بأشكال نضالية جديدة، استثمار حركات التضامن الشعبي الدولي، توظيف القانون الدولي ومنظومة حقوق الإنسان، نزع الشرعية عن الصهيونية كمساوية للإبادة الجماعية ومش بس للتمييز العنصري، استثمار قرار الاستشاري لمحكمة العدل الدولية اللي أكد كل الإجراءات باطلة وإسرائيل دولة تمييز عنصري وبتمارس الاستيطان والأبرتايد وكل هاي الأمور، وأيضا الاستثمار بما يتعلق بالاعترافات الدولية بحق تقرير المصير للشعب الفلسطيني. وأساس الكفاح الوطني الآن بده قضيتين برأيي: إعادة هيكلة الحركة الوطنية الفلسطينية، بمعنى أن ندرك أننا في مرحلة تحرر وطني تتطلب صمود مقاوم وتتطلب أشكال مبدعة ذكية قادرة على استعطاف العالم وتحيد عملية تكتيل الصهيونية للقوى الاستعمارية تحت شعار الخطر الوجودي اللي أخذ كمبرر للجنوسايد على قطاع غزة، في الكفاح القانوني، الكفاح السياسي، الكفاح الدبلوماسي، ولكن شرطية ذلك كله تقع على محور واحد أساسي: إعادة هيكلة الحركة الوطنية، بمعنى منظمة التحرير كجبهة وطنية عريضة تتعزز بها المشاركة الشعبية. وبهذه الحالة بصير في استيعاب لكل مبادرات الشباب والنساء والعمال، وإعادة الحيوية لبنية المجتمع الفلسطيني كما كانت إبان بدايات التحرر الوطني، لما كانت اتحادات الشعبية التابعة لمنظمة التحرير تلعب دور توحيدي للهوية الوطنية الفلسطينية، اتحاد الكتاب على سبيل المثال، وتلعب دور استقطابي للمتضامنين الدوليين مع حقوق شعبنا، وتنزع الشرعية عن ممارسات الصهيونية والاحتلال. بمعنى الموضوع بحاجة إلى ترتيبات في البيت الداخلي الفلسطيني وإبداعات بأشكال النضال التي لا تأخذ بعين الاعتبار البعد النخبوي الفئوي، بل التشاركية الشعبية المبنية على قدرة الشعب على الصمود وإلحاق الخسائر بالخصم، وليس العكس، بمعنى إرهاق المجتمع ودفعه باتجاه الهجرة الطوعية أو القسرية.
شكرا لك، شكرا على الملاحظة. طيب إذا عندنا الكثير من الملاحظات كلها تقريبا بتحكي عن شو البدائل بالوضع الحالي، حالة استقطاب، التفكر بهيكلية وطنية جديدة، المجموعات الموجودة، هل هي أحزاب، هل هي حركات، نزع الشرعية عن الصهيونية، استخدام الأطر القانونية الموجودة. رح أفتح المجال ليارا وبعدين مهند تردوا.
Thank you, Leif, for your question or comment. As you said, Dalhat was not a representative body of all Palestinian women. It did have initially quite high ambitions to be a decentralized umbrella for Palestinian decolonial feminists, but that never came to be. But Dalhat, as you said, was part of a series of youth movements that emerged over the last decade and a half. Many of the women were also previously involved in other movements that have been a part of the sort of, that have come from urban centers like Ramallah, Jerusalem, Haifa. And obviously also, you know, it's not a surprise that these movements have emerged and have also dissipated. And I think it's really important to ask ourselves why. Why are these movements not sustaining themselves? Why are they not able to continue? And perhaps there is something in it that movements are not political parties, and so they do miss that sort of structure, that political parties have. And so I think, of course, there are some examples where it's happened where movements have been able to sustain themselves outside of the sort of formal political party structure, but I think it's really difficult. And in this moment in time, the reality is that it's virtually impossible to establish a new Palestinian political party, regardless of whether you're in 48 or 67. And so in a way, the youth who are not affiliated with political parties have been forced to express themselves politically and organize themselves politically through these popular movements. So as you said, I don't think there is necessarily an answer to that comment or that question, but I think it's a really important thing to think about, is why these movements aren't able to sustain themselves, and what kind of possibility is there for a structure, a movement structure that can sort of withstand the test of time?
Thank you for all the comments, and I agree with the analysis put forward by the speakers here. You know, so let me try to do it this way. We have tried everything. There's nothing that we haven't tried, and I always say that to people in the West that want to come to us. Have you tried this? We tried everything. Before you ask that question, we've tried it all. So the context is really stacked up against us. You know, opposing U.S. imperial designs, it's not easy. So we can't do it alone. We can't liberate ourselves by ourselves. I wish we could, but we can't. So we do need people. We do need people across the world to help us and to stand with us and to participate in us, not just morally support us, but materially support us through things like the withdrawal of participation. So where do we turn? I mean, we turn everywhere. We continue to go, whatever context Palestinians find themselves in, trust me, they're trying. We try in Canada, we try everywhere. But to me, in this context, in this world today, our best hope lies in the Global South. Now, the Global South is not a monolith. There's many states in the Global South that are acting against us. There are many people across the Global South who we've lost a connection with, who don't know our story anymore, who understand it through the American and Israeli lens. So we do have a lot of work to do in the Global South. But the reason I still turn there is because I find that there is a natural alliance of interests there at the bottom of our interaction, unlike our interaction with the West, whose underlying interest is in our oppression and in our genocide. This should be clear to everyone now, that even those in the West that think that this is tragic, they also at some level understand it's in their interests, and that they do generate enormous power and wealth for their countries through our genocide. There is widespread sentiment, I believe, in my reading of a Global South movements especially, but among day-to-day people as well, that they're fed up with neocolonialism and imperialism. They might not always use those terms, but you don't need people to use academic terms and to give you, sound like Fanon for them to be thinking those ways. Look at just West African states and their views on the French. Now, they're replacing the French with the Russians, there is widespread sentiments in many parts of the world that this international system is set up to benefit the West and the West only at their expense. The decolonization struggles of the 20th century have failed to achieve real decolonial liberation for the majority of the people in the Global South. This is starting to be reflected in some of the state discourse as well. Now, of course, scholars, as they should, and is probably right, some of those state officials are just, giving talk, but while still being complicit or acquiescent to U.S. imperialism. But eventually, these sentiments they can be cultivated. They can be nourished. And in that sort of rejuvenation process, I do think that we need to be very deliberate about placing the Palestinian struggle in with that sentiment. That's the sentiment that if it becomes the dominant one, will benefit us the most. So like I said, then we come to the big question of what do we do with the Palestinian Authority and that structure, because it has led to demobilization, as both of you, the three of you have pointed out, really, and Yara as well. To me, that was one of the most deadly strategies that the Israeli state has not deadly, that's the wrong word to use. One of the most effective, unfortunately, strategies of the Israeli state to defeat our cause is to create the PA. It led to demobilization almost immediately. It was intended, in my view, even if it wasn't consciously that way by some of its architects on the Israeli side, it was intended to stop precisely the kind of mobilization that we saw in the first Intifada. It's not a coincidence that the Israelis criminalized the popular committees during the first Intifada and feared it. Feared it more than the kids throwing the stones. Of course, that's not what the discourse they sent to the public in the West, but that was really what terrified them from the first Intifada, was the mass mobilization. This is what they didn't want to see happen again. And the PA was their move to do that, and unfortunately it has worked. So we now are contending with this structure that is designed to prevent us from the kind of mobilization that we need. Now, does that mean it's the death knell of that kind of mobilization? No. If you look at I go back to the 1930s was the first time we saw that kind of mass mobilization. They had popular committees that looked a lot like the Intifada. If someone is better than math at me, that's about 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, 40 years plus, where we didn't see mass mobilization like which we saw in the 30s, but re-emerge in the first Intifada. So we might have to wait another long way before something like that re-emerges. But it maintains its presence in Gaza. On grassroots levels, it still exists in Palestine. It's just not happening on the mass scale precisely because the PA prevents it. So what do we do? So when the question of what do we do, I try to kind of, as a scholar, I'm a theorist. I wish I had the blueprint to share with you. If I had one, I would have shared it long ago. But I don't. As a theorist, you try your best to kind of classify and clarify paths and concepts and that kind of thing. So to do that again, we have short-term, intermediate term, and long-term. In my view, unfortunately, in the short term and intermediate term, we're continuing with some really dark times, and really testing times. And I fear it will get even tougher than it has been over the last 15 months. I still believe in the Palestinian ability to withstand these dark times. I think we'll come out of it at the end. And I think the long term looks better for us, but the long term is really far away. I don't expect to be alive myself. I hope I'm wrong. But inshallah, I think what we have to be doing at this moment, like I said, is to continue, like you said, sumud, presence on the land, continue to understand and communicate what Zionism really is. To the whole world, not just to the global south, but to the whole world. Continue with that path. Continue with revealing its reality. We don't have to delegitimize Zionism. We just have to present its reality, and its reality delegitimizes it. They delegitimize themselves by themselves. We just have to continue to insist on truth. And in my view, double down on placing ourselves at the center of a decolonial, anti-imperial project that tries to rejuvenate that spirit of Bandung and that spirit of decolonization of the 1960s and 1970s. This, to me, is still our path. There's never going to be a Palestinian liberation with American imperialism. Those two are never going to coexist. We need a weakened American empire. And we need to be, I think, openly and actively working towards it. It's not like if you say that out loud, the Americans will be upset. They already hate us. I don't know if you've noticed. It's not just Trump. They're already against us, no matter what you say. I think those are the paths that we work on. And like I said, there's three paths of decolonization that are needed. The decolonization of Palestinian leadership structures, so the PA, the decolonization of state structures in the global south, and the decolonization of the international system itself. We need to move on all three, and maybe some advances in one might help lead to advances in the other. Many people around the world wait for us. By the way, I can tell you that in my conversations with people in South Africa, it's hard for, they'll say it's hard for us to move when the PA is doing this and that. It's hard for us to move when there's no unified message coming from Palestine. And I say, I know, I hear you, but maybe you can make some movements and some wins that will help, that will encourage people there to go, okay, you know, so let's try to get a win in any one of those three areas. Let's try to get some success in one, and maybe that will help the other, as opposed to trying to say it has to go in this chronological order. But it's, of course, always the hard part is how. And as a theorist, I wish I had better answers to that. But yeah.
Thank you, Mehند. Thank you, Yara. I'll take another round, but I was wondering, what would you consider the Arab siblings? Global South, Global North, colonized in the head? I'm not sure. How do you deal with that? So I think that's the PA and the Arab siblings are trouble. So okay, I'll take تفضل. برجع لك بعد.
Thank you all for the interventions. I wanted to ask a question, maybe in its most simplest form is to Mehند, who is the we? When you say we, and I'm thinking, I wonder if the state thinking historically, but also nation thinking and the national, so the Palestinian nation, is contrary or has been in opposition to people's kind of intrinsic sort of need to connect across geographies, so not territorially bound. So yesterday Marwan Kabalan was saying Syrians used to think of their land as occupied pre-1967. And in Lebanon, we think of our land as occupied even today, not just South Lebanon, right? So the land is not, you know, who am I as a Lebanese citizen? Am I Lebanese just because of citizenship? And is that not also colonial thinking, right? So I wonder if there's a limitation in just thinking of this as a Palestinian national struggle, which is already colonial thinking, so it's mandate thinking rather than, and so if we continue thinking that way, it's in a way, this is what the Zionist wants, is to divide us up. And if we think, you know, of course, when you think like that, they tell you the قومية السورية and so on, and there's like a bad kind of reputation of that, but you know, at its core, there's something true about it, right? Regardless of how its implementation and its alliances through the years and so on. But yeah, so I guess the part of what you're touching on is also a question of that you didn't touch on is who's the we, which goes back to Palestine. And then I wish Leyla was here because she was talking about the Confederaliya. And for me, all these sort of nation thinkings just lead to the worst possible Lebanese sectarianism. If I was Zionist, I would never accept a binational state. Why would I? There's a binational type state across the border is Lebanon, which produces a sectarian thinking. So yeah, just trying to think out loud with you.
Thank you very much, Sami. تفضلي.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Isabella, I'm from the Global South. I'm Brazilian. I look like Arab, but I'm not, and I don't speak Arabic, so I'm sorry if I repeat some of the questions that was already made. But I have two questions, one for Dr. Yara, Howari. Was wondering if you could tell us more about how the organizations that you were studying, PFC, and the other one,
طلعت.
They keep with, or they, I'm sorry with my English, how they deal with neoliberalism and neoliberal colonialism in Palestine, especially in the West Bank. I am writing an article with Professor Bruno Uberman from São Paulo. We are trying to understand how neoliberal colonialism weakens the grassroots movements of Palestinian feminism. So I would like to hear more from you about this. And the question for Dr. Muhammad, it's about also a provocation about the Arab siblings. I was wondering, for example, in the Global South, as you said, it's not a monolith, but we have BRICS. In last year, some of the Arab countries joined the BRICS, like Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates. So, how do you see the contradictions between state organization, the Arab states organization, within the Global South, but also the so-called Arab Street, like the pressure of Arab people in government? And I say this because in Brazil we have this struggle also. We have Lula's government was supposed to be a leftist, and you was supposed to support Palestinians, but at the same time they have really strong relations with the Israeli state, especially the arms industry. The arms industry actually is where we are trying to show people from Brazil that, for example, the arms that Brazilian state buys from Israel is the same arms that are tested, of course, on the Palestinians, and after they are used in the black communities from the favelas, for example. So it's a very difficult movement to do, but this is the kind of pressure that we have to do as people from the Global South. So thank you again.
شكرا. ثالث سؤال بس لو سمحتوا نكون كتير سريعين عشان يكون عندنا وقت نجاوب وبعدين نطلع على الوقت. في سؤال ثالث؟ لا. اوكي. مهند تحب يارا بتبلشي؟
Yeah, maybe just before I answer your question about neoliberalism, I mean, I think we've said this already, that the Global South is not a monolith. You know, India, various countries in Africa are very, very pro-Zionist, if not Zionist, you know, in terms of ideology. A lot of this comes from Islamophobia as well, but also purely because of the benefits that comes with being an ally of Israel, you know, including surveillance technologies that are then used on domestic populations, including in our region, but also, you know, weapons, trade, etc., as you mentioned in Latin America. So by all means, we can't assume that the Global South means radical or anti or decolonial. But I think what we do find in the Global South, I mean, in addition to the history of interconnected struggles, which we also shouldn't romanticize, but that history does exist. But I think what we do find there is a desire to challenge US unipolarity and the current status quo in a way that we don't find in the Global North. And that is what is needed essentially for Palestinian liberation. You know, Palestinian liberation is not going to come about with US unipolarity. We see that in BRICS, we see that in, you know, other formations. So I think that's where the opportunities lie, and I think that all of that comes with the huge caveat of not over-romanticizing the Global South. Just because someone is from the Global South doesn't mean that they are inherently for Palestinian liberation. Neoliberalism in Palestine is something, and I'll speak specifically to the West Bank. It's something that Talhat in Ramallah was very acutely aware of and very critical of, particularly in terms of how this had an effect on Palestinian civil society and the lexicon and discourse of liberation within Palestinian civil society. There was a lot of, you know, with the onset of neoliberalism in the West Bank, there was a lot of buzz around sort of women's empowerment that sort of happened simultaneously. And so we saw a lot of these terms and buzzwords that emerged that were solely used actually just to get project funding for these different initiatives. So we saw the term empowerment being used a lot for women. But of course, the term empowerment was very much limited to socioeconomic empowerment. And participation in what they call decision-making, rather than empowering women to resist occupation or, you know, build various infrastructure to prevent or at least slow down house demolitions. They did not mean empowerment in that sense at all. And so, you know, and this obviously stands in stark contrast to what Mehند mentioned of the sort of the various initiatives during the first Intifada. So we also saw this sort of through different UN agencies that sort of really take the lead in terms of women's rights. And what you find as a sort of commonality across all these different campaigns that are, you know, obviously usually led by white women or imposed by white women on various different Palestinian NGOs, is that colonization and occupation is omitted from all of this discourse, and there is that focus on sort of empowering women, you know, to fight the social barriers that they face within Palestinian society, completely disconnected from settler colonial occupation. So this process has depoliticized not only, you know, in many ways the Palestinian women's movement, but civil society across the board. We also see it manifested in the Palestinian Authority institutions and structures. The sort of West's idea of making the Palestinian authorities gender-friendly includes the creation of women's units in the security forces, which means that at demonstrations, women are now arrested with ease, whereas before sort of security units might be a bit more apprehensive about manhandling women at demonstrations. Now they can do so easily because they have women to do it for them. So it's very much was very much part of the analysis, but also, you know, very much grounded in an understanding of the reality on the ground.
Thank you so much, Yara. It's also like putting the Palestinian cause within humanitarian frames rather than political frames. So like, yeah, as you said, depoliticizing the whole movement, basically. Mehند, تفضل.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with Sammy's and then bring it back to the Arab siblings.
By the way, you have like 3 minutes.
Okay, so very quickly, the last few years, Hamid Dabashi and Mamdani both wrote 2 books on the critiques of the nation state. Mamdani says the problem is the nation, the state is fine. That's where the problem, you know, the monstrosity comes in, is the nation. And that's where colonialism is. Dabashi goes the complete other way and says the monstrosity is the state. The nation is actually a non-colonial form of belonging that exists before and beyond the colonial modernity, the kind of the nationalism that emerges in colonial modernity. I tend to find good insights from both. So to me, national thinking in itself can take on varied forms. One that would be more colonial, one that would be anti-colonial. You know, Fanon made it very clear. The anti-colonial national struggle should, to remain anti-colonial, should avoid the kind of nationalism, what Mamdani would later call conservative nationalism, that would reproduce colonial grammar and logic and so on. But that there has to be a sort of collectivity identity of the people engaged in their locality. But that they have to understand that that is part of a larger decolonial struggle against the project of European colonialism in general. So I don't think with any of these things that there's inherently something in nationalism, or even the state for that matter, that makes it such that it is necessarily reproducing of colonial modernity, but the certain specific manifestations of those things that we need to be wary of. And that's why I always do situate the Palestinian struggle within a larger decolonial struggle against colonial modernity, because it has all those connections, not just in the Arab world, but beyond, to struggles against settler colonialism on Turtle Island, in Australia, and so on. you know, again, situating it within that larger struggle is one way to avoid reproducing the grammar and logics of colonial modernity. That's a very short answer to that, but yes, very important points that you raised there. And you know, I agree with what Yara says, and as the person themselves mentioned in your comment there, there's a difference between the states and the people. You know, that's quite, you know, we all know that very well in terms of the Arab world. The Arab regimes say one thing, the people feel something completely different. This is why I say the structure of the state has to also be decolonized in the global south. Now that one is also a very tricky one because it scares the global south quite a lot. And you're asking them at the same time to press sanctions. You know, it's a kind of a confusing message for South Africa, let's say, to take an easy one. And that's not easy. So that tells you how more difficult it is for others. When you go to that state and you say, thank you for the genocide case, can you please now press for sanctions and yourself economically cut ties with Israel. Oh, by the way, you need to decolonize too. This is not an easy message to communicate. I understand it from their perspective. It's not an easy message to hear. It will sound confusing. So there's a lot of, I think, strategizing that needs to happen. On the grassroots level, I think movements across the world, not just in Palestine, have made a mistake for many years by not considering geopolitical context, and have always tended to avoid that discussion and find it a little bit gross. Oh, we're not going to get it. No, it's not, you're in it. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. This is your context. You have to strategize. You have to think about these issues. I think there needs to be more growth and development in mass mobilizing on the grassroots level when it comes to these questions. And there's many obstacles and difficulties that stand in the way of that, but we also have new means of organizing today that we didn't have access to 30, 40 years ago. Of course, you know, social media and information technology is always a double-edged sword, but it does open the road for different kinds of mobilization practices that I think, you know, it could be used in this kind of effort. So it's, again, the road is long, the road is very difficult, but I don't know another option. I don't know what else to do. We're not going to give up, and we can't keep going. The path that we've been going on with the PA and that kind of discourse has led us to where we are today. So that's not an option either. So to me, we have to take these moments of darkness to think big. And I think, in fact, in the darkest of moments is when you have to dream the biggest. And that's why I said in the beginning, it's an aspirational paper, because we do need that kind of thinking in these moments, and action that is based and emerges from that kind of aspirational thinking. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mehند. Thank you so much, Yara. Thank you, everyone. I think you can take your break now and see you in the next session.